Nazi Germany is defeated. The guns are silent. Champagne flows at Allied victory banquets. But one American general refuses to celebrate. While the world declares peace, General George S. Patton quietly tells his staff something chilling. We have defeated the wrong enemy. Days later, at a Soviet victory banquet, a Russian general raises a glass to toast Allied unity. Everyone expects Patton to drink. He doesn't. Instead, Patton stands up and says something so explosive that translators freeze, Soviet officers go silent, and history quietly turns a corner. But to understand what Patton said, we must first understand why he said it. On May 8, 1945, Europe erupted in celebration. VE Day marked the end of the most destructive war in human history. Cities rang with church bells. Soldiers hugged strangers. Politicians spoke of unity, cooperation, and a peaceful future. But beneath the speeches and parades, the alliance that defeated Hitler was already cracking. Nowhere was that tension more visible than inside Allied headquarters in Central Europe. American, British, and Soviet officers attended formal banquets meant to symbolize unity, but the mood was strained. The Red Army had paid a horrific price defeating Nazi Germany, yet their presence in Eastern Europe raised quiet alarm among Western commanders. General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, did not hide his discomfort. He viewed these banquets not as celebrations, but as political theater. To Patton, war was not over simply because Berlin had fallen. He believed another confrontation was already forming, one driven by ideology, expansion, and power. While other generals toasted peace, Patton studied the Soviet officers across the room. Their discipline impressed him, their intentions did not. Victory, to Patton, felt unfinished.
Patton's unease was not sudden. As early as 1944, he privately warned fellow officers that the Soviet Union posed a long-term threat to Europe. He admired Russian toughness, but distrusted their political system and expansionist behavior. In his wartime diary, Patton wrote bluntly that cooperation with Moscow was temporary and dangerous. By May 1945, those thoughts hardened into conviction. As Soviet forces occupied Poland, Hungary, and much of Eastern Europe, Patton saw the map changing in real time. To him, Nazi Germany had been crushed, but a new power vacuum had emerged, and the Red Army was filling it. It was during this period that Patton reportedly said words that would later define his legacy. "We have defeated the wrong enemy." The statement shocked his peers. The public narrative demanded unity. Washington wanted stability. Millions of soldiers wanted to go home. Patton wanted clarity. And clarity, he believed, required honesty, no matter how uncomfortable.
In May 1945, Patton met senior Red Army commanders during coordination talks in Central Europe. Among them was Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin, one of Stalin's most capable generals and a key architect of Soviet victories in the Balkans and Austria. The meeting was outwardly cordial. Handshakes were exchanged, interpreters carefully translated each sentence, cameras rolled for propaganda photographs. But the contrast between the two men was unmistakable. Tolbukhin represented the disciplined, politically loyal Red Army, an army that answered directly to Stalin. Patton represented a professional officer class that distrusted ideology and valued battlefield reality over diplomacy. Patton studied the Soviet formations with a soldier's eye.
He later remarked that if war came again, it would be brutal, and it would come soon. This meeting set the stage for the incident that followed days later at a formal victory banquet. A moment meant to symbolize Allied brotherhood would instead expose how thin that brotherhood truly was, and it would all hinge on a single raised glass.
By late April 1945, Patton's Third Army stood poised to push deeper into Czechoslovakia. His armored divisions were moving fast, German resistance was collapsing, and Prague lay within operational reach. But the order came down from Supreme Allied Headquarters: stop, hold the line, do not advance further east. The agreed demarcation line, negotiated between Washington, London, and Moscow, meant American forces would halt while the Red Army advanced. Officially, this was to avoid accidental clashes between allies. Unofficially, it acknowledged Soviet political claims over Eastern Europe. Patton was furious. He believed the order handed strategic territory to Stalin without a fight. To Patton, it wasn't diplomacy, it was surrender by paperwork. He openly complained that his men could have reached Prague first and prevented Soviet occupation. This forced halt did more than frustrate Patton. It confirmed his fear that the war's final battles were being decided not on the battlefield, but in conference rooms far from the front. And it hardened his resolve to speak plainly, even when silence was expected. Patton was not blind to Soviet strength. In fact, he respected it. He carefully observed Red Army units as they advanced westward. Massive formations, hardened veterans, ruthless efficiency. But what impressed him also disturbed him. Patton noted the Red Army's political officers, rigid discipline, and total loyalty to Moscow. These were not soldiers who would simply go home after victory. They were instruments of state power. In private conversations, Patton remarked that Soviet commanders smiled during meetings, but measured terrain, infrastructure, and supply routes with calculating precision. They weren't just winning a war, they were positioning for the future. This duality troubled him deeply. To Patton, the Red Army fought like conquerors, not liberators. While Allied propaganda emphasized brotherhood, Patton saw an occupying force preparing to reshape Europe. He believed the West misunderstood Stalin's intentions, and that misunderstanding would cost generations. By the time invitations were sent for a joint victory banquet, Patton's mind was already made up. If forced to play along, he would not pretend.
The banquet was staged to project harmony. Held in early May 1945, it brought together senior American and Soviet officers in a formal hall adorned with flags, medals, and polished tableware. Cameras recorded every handshake. Translators stood ready to soften words where needed. Vodka and wine flowed freely. To outside observers, it was a victory celebration. To those inside, it was a performance. Patton sat stiffly, speaking little. He watched how toasts were made, each one praising unity, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between allies. Soviet officers raised their glasses with practiced ceremony. American officers followed suit. Everyone understood the script. Everyone except Patton. When a senior Russian general finally stood and proposed a toast to Allied victory and future friendship, the room turned toward Patton. His response mattered. His participation would signal compliance. Instead, Patton did something entirely unexpected. He pushed his chair back.
As Patton stood, the room fell quiet.
Exchangers exchanged nervous glances. Soviet officers paused, glasses hovering in mid-air. This was not part of the program. No one was sure whether Patton intended to reciprocate the toast or disrupt it. Patton did not reach for his glass. Instead, he straightened his uniform, fixed his gaze on the Russian general who had proposed the toast, and began to speak slowly, deliberately, so that every word could be translated. Those closest to him later recalled a tension so thick it felt physical. One mistranslated sentence could trigger an international incident. One poorly chosen phrase could end careers. The interpreter hesitated, fully aware that what he was about to translate might carry consequences far beyond the room. Patton, however, showed no hesitation at all. The words that followed would echo for decades. But Patton was not finished yet.
Patton's voice was calm, but unmistakably firm. Before delivering his response, he turned slightly toward the interpreter and gave a quiet instruction that immediately raised alarm. Translate exactly. Do not soften it. The interpreter hesitated. In Allied meetings, translators were often expected to smooth sharp edges, to replace blunt phrases with diplomatic language. Patton's demand removed that safety net entirely. Across the table, Soviet officers sensed the shift. This was no longer ceremonial. This was personal. Patton did not raise his glass. He did not smile. He spoke as a soldier addressing another soldier, not as a diplomat seeking consensus. Those who witnessed the moment later recalled that Patton's tone was neither angry nor theatrical. It was cold, deliberate, almost clinical. This was not an outburst. It was a warning.
Patton began by acknowledging the defeat of Nazi Germany. His words were measured, factual, and free of praise. There was no flattery, no talk of eternal friendship. Then the tone shifted. Rather than offering thanks, Patton questioned the future. He spoke of armies that did not withdraw after victory, of nations that replaced one form of domination with another, of wars that ended only on paper. The interpreter translated slowly, carefully, fully aware that each sentence tightened the atmosphere. Soviet officers stiffened. This was not the expected message of unity. It was an accusation, delivered without shouting, without insult, but unmistakable in meaning. Patton made it clear that he believed Europe was not free, merely transferred, that one tyranny had fallen while another advanced behind it. The toast glass in Patton's hand remained untouched. The room waited for the final line.
Then Patton delivered the line that would define the evening. Addressing the Russian general directly, he stated, without raising his voice, that he did not consider the Soviet Union a true ally, but a future adversary. He warned that their armies now stood where German armies once stood, and that history would judge the difference. According to multiple post-war recollections, Patton concluded by refusing to drink to a partnership he did not believe in. The interpreter paused. For a moment, no one spoke. The translator knew exactly what the words meant and exactly what they could cost him. Finally, he translated. When the meaning landed, glasses lowered, smiles vanished, chairs creaked as officers shifted uncomfortably. This was not a misunderstanding. Patton meant every word.
What followed surprised everyone. Instead of anger, one of the Soviet generals laughed. Not a warm laugh, but a sharp, knowing one. The laughter broke the tension, but it did not erase the message. Some Soviet officers smirked, others stared coldly. They understood Patton was not bluffing. They also understood that no other Western general would have spoken this way. The Russian general reportedly raised his glass again, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. The message had been received. The interpreter exhaled in relief. Patton sat back down without touching his drink. In that moment, the banquet resumed, but the illusion was gone. Whatever unity had existed that night ended at that table.
News of the incident traveled quietly through Allied command circles. Official reports omitted it. Public statements ignored it. But privately, Patton's reputation shifted. To some, he was reckless, undermining diplomacy at the most fragile moment of peace. To others, he was the only senior commander willing to say what many suspected but would not voice. Patton himself showed no regret. In his diary, he continued to warn that the Soviet Union would not stop at agreed borders, that Eastern Europe would not be free, that another war, colder, longer, and ideological, was already beginning. At the banquet, Patton had crossed a line, but in hindsight, he may also have drawn one. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, Patton's concerns moved from private warnings to operational thinking. He did not merely believe the Soviet Union would become an adversary. He believed the West was briefly positioned to stop it. Patton argued that large numbers of German soldiers remained intact, disciplined, and anti-communist. In internal conversations, he suggested that if a conflict with the Soviet Union became inevitable, it would be better to confront it immediately, before Red Army positions solidified across Eastern Europe. This idea was politically radioactive. To civilian leaders and Allied command, the notion of rearming former enemies, even temporarily, was unacceptable. The war had just ended. The public demanded demobilization, not preparation for another conflict. But to Patton, strategy did not wait for public sentiment. He believed history rewarded those who acted early and punished those who hesitated. His proposal never left informal discussion, but word of it traveled fast. In Washington, priorities had shifted. President Truman faced a war-weary nation. Millions of American soldiers wanted to come home. Europe needed rebuilding. Stability, not confrontation, was the official objective. Patton's outspoken views now appeared increasingly dangerous. His public remarks criticizing Soviet behavior conflicted directly with administration policy. Diplomacy required careful language. Patton refused to use it. Senior officers quietly concluded that Patton was becoming a liability, not because he lacked military skill, but because he would not adapt to the political reality of post-war leadership. His command of the Third Army was reassigned. Officially, it was routine. Unofficially, it sidelined him. Patton knew exactly what it meant. He had not lost a battle. He had lost influence. Despite his reduced role, Patton continued to speak candidly in private correspondence and diary entries. He warned that Soviet occupation would harden into permanent control, that free elections promised in Eastern Europe would never materialize, that ideological conflict would replace open warfare. In this period, Patton made another chilling observation. The next war, he believed, would not begin with tanks, but with borders, propaganda, and fear. Few listened. The public narrative demanded optimism. Allied unity remained the official story. Any suggestion of future conflict was dismissed as warmongering. But within a few years, iron curtains would descend, proxy wars would erupt, and Europe would remain divided for nearly half a century. Patton would not live to see that future.
but he had described it with unsettling accuracy.
By late 1945, Patton was increasingly isolated. His honesty, once celebrated in wartime, was now viewed as insubordination. He was reassigned to command the 15th Army, a largely administrative role focused on writing war histories. For a man who thrived on action, it was a quiet exile. Rumors swirled. Some believed Patton was being punished. Others argued he simply could not function in peacetime politics. Both views contained elements of truth. What is clear is this: Patton no longer shaped policy. He observed it from the margins. And he did not approve of what he saw. In the decades that followed Patton's death, events unfolded much as he had feared. Eastern Europe fell behind the Iron Curtain. NATO and the Warsaw Pact faced each other across divided Germany. The Cold War stretched from Berlin to Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Patton's critics argued that conflict with the Soviet Union in 1945 would have been catastrophic. His supporters countered that delaying confrontation allowed Soviet power to solidify. History offers no easy verdict, but one fact remains undeniable. Patton recognized the coming struggle earlier than most, and at a victory banquet in May 1945, he said aloud what others would not. On December 9, 1945, less than 7 months after Germany's surrender, General George S. Patton was traveling near Mannheim, Germany, when his staff car collided with a U.S. Army truck at low speed. The accident was unremarkable by wartime standards. No other passengers were seriously injured, but Patton was thrown forward, suffering a severe neck injury that left him paralyzed. He remained conscious. Patton understood the gravity of his condition almost immediately. He reportedly remarked that it was a hell of a way to die, especially after surviving years of combat across North Africa and Europe. 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, George S. Patton died from complications related to his injuries. He was 60 years old. The man who had survived thousands of artillery barrages did not fall in battle. He died in peacetime. News of Patton's death spread quickly, but quietly. There were no massive state funerals, no grand public reckoning. The war was over, and the world was moving on. For many Americans, Patton's bluntness had become uncomfortable. For policymakers, his passing removed a persistent problem. Almost immediately, questions emerged. How could such a minor accident prove fatal? Why was Patton the only one seriously injured? Why had he been sidelined only weeks earlier? Official investigations found no evidence of foul play. The Army concluded the death was accidental. But speculation never disappeared. For supporters, the timing felt suspicious. For critics, the explanation was simple. Patton had always lived on borrowed time. What is certain is this: Patton died before he could fully articulate his post-war vision, leaving others to interpret it for him. Over time, Patton's death became entangled with myth. Some claimed he was silenced for speaking against the Soviets. Others linked his fate to broader Cold War paranoia. These interpretations gained traction decades later, fueled by distrust of institutions and the dramatic contrast between his wartime dominance and quiet end. Historians, however, caution against drawing conclusions unsupported by evidence. There is no verified documentation proving assassination, no credible witness testimony, no declassified record confirming a plot. What does exist are Patton's own words, his diaries, letters, and recorded statements, which reveal a man deeply convinced that the post-war settlement was flawed. The danger is not myth itself. The danger is allowing myth to overshadow what Patton actually said and why it mattered. Within months of Patton's death, his warnings began to echo in official language. In March 1946, Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech, publicly acknowledging the division Patton had described privately. By 1947,
American policy openly recognized the Soviet Union as a strategic rival. Eastern Europe remained under communist control for decades. The Cold War that Patton feared, long, ideological, and global, became reality. Whether Patton's proposed solutions would have worked is unknowable. What is clear is that he identified the problem earlier than most. He was not alone, but he was among the few willing to say it without restraint.
The Russian toast incident was not about insult. It was about refusal. Patton refused to pretend the war had settled Europe's future. He refused to celebrate a peace he believed was temporary. And he refused to speak in language designed to obscure reality. When he stood at that banquet in May 1945, he was not predicting the Cold War by name, but he was describing its shape. In that moment, Patton was not a politician. He was a soldier, thinking in terms of consequences, not ceremonies. And history, slowly and imperfectly, would come to understand why.
Decades after his death, George S. Patton remains one of the most polarizing figures of World War II. To some, he was reckless, too blunt for diplomacy, too aggressive for peace, a general who could win battles but not navigate politics. To others, he was painfully honest, a commander who understood that wars do not truly end when armies surrender, but when power is settled. This division explains why audiences still argue about Patton today. His critics judge him by what might have happened had his ideas been followed. His supporters judge him by what actually happened when they were not. Eastern Europe remained under Soviet control for nearly 50 years. The Cold War consumed trillions of dollars, millions of lives, and multiple generations. Patton did not cause that future, but he recognized its outline before it had a name. That is why his words still provoke debate.
At the Russian victory banquet in May 1945, Patton faced a choice. He could raise his glass, follow the script, and let history smooth over the tension. Many did. Or he could speak honestly, knowing that honesty would isolate him. Patton chose the second. He did not insult for spectacle. He did not refuse the toast out of arrogance. He refused because he believed pretending would be more dangerous than silence. In that moment, Patton accepted the cost of being right too early. He lost influence, he lost command, and within months he lost his life, not in battle, but in obscurity. Yet the future he warned about arrived anyway.
When the Russian general offered a toast to unity, Patton refused to drink. History eventually answered that refusal. The alliance fractured, borders hardened, Europe divided. The Cold War defined the second half of the 20th century. Patton did not live to see the Iron Curtain fall. He never saw the Soviet Union collapse. But the conflict he sensed, cold, ideological, and global, unfolded exactly as he feared. The toast was forgotten by official record. The warning was not. And that is why, nearly 80 years later, one moment at a victory banquet still matters. Not because of what Patton refused to drink, but because of what he refused to pretend.
Patton paid a price for speaking early. Many stories like this are still misunderstood or forgotten. If you believe history deserves honesty more than comfort, subscribe now for more. Thank you so much for watching.